Damn it, Minato! Not again! Exclaimed Kushina, looking through the hollow between her pale chest at her husband's small flaccid wand, which was at arm's length above her. Minato sighed and rolled off his wife, lying down next to her on the bed. I'm sorry, Kushina, but I'm getting old. There is nothing to be done. He rolled over on his side, turning away from her, and sighed again. Maybe we can try again tomorrow? Kushina looked at her husband angrily, crossing her arms over her huge chest. Soon, she heard steady snoring, which indicated that her husband was fast asleep. Throwing off the bedspread in disgust, Kushina walked naked into the large master bathroom connected to the bedroom. She closed the door behind her and turned on the light above the sink. What's his problem? She thought to herself as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. Kushina looked amazing for her 36-year-old. Her red hair was thick and shiny, reaching down to her lower back. She had sharp cheekbones and a small nose, which accentuated her large, bright purple eyes and full pink lips. She was taller than most women and was 5 feet 7 inches, 170 centimeters, tall, and her waist was flexible and thin. In general, her figure was perfect due to frequent visits to the gym combined with good genes. Her legs were long and athletic, like a dancer's. And the ass might have been a little big for her thin waist, but it was still firm with sexy dimples on her cheeks. However, her most striking feature was her chest, which were larger than her own head. And despite their huge size, they were as perky as in adolescence. They swayed deliciously as she took them in her small hands, and her fingers sank into the hard flesh. Kushina bit her lower lip in disappointment, looking at her reflection with a sad expression on her face. I'm at the peak of my sexuality, she thought to herself. I don't have to wait. My husband only makes my life harder. Kushina sighed again, returning to the bedroom. You want the full story, without censorship? Then rush to my Patreon. For just $4 a month, you unlock over 380 episodes of epic fan stories, from fandoms you've never even heard of. From classics like Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, to One Punch Man, DxD, and tons of taboo crossovers found nowhere else. Link in the description, or pinned comment. Subscribe now, and drown in unfiltered adult heat. One sub, the entire NSFW multiverse, in your pocket. She pulled her little silk blue robe out of the closet and draped it over her curves, then walked over to the bed and pulled a large DVD out of the bedside table. Unbeknownst to Kushina, her son Naruto was eavesdropping on his parents' bedroom door with a big smile on his face. He was well aware of the problems occurring in his parents' sex lives. He spent many nights standing at their bedroom door, listening to his parents' sounds and imagining what his mother should look like when she gets her chest massaged. However, it seemed that more often than not, Naruto's father could not satisfy his mother, and she remained angry and frustrated. Naruto began to think about how to act on this information, but could not think of anything. 3 weeks ago, however, Kushina helped him decide on a course of action when one night around 12 p.m., he woke up and went to the kitchen to drink water and came across his mother in the living room completely naked. On the big TV screen there was, which was watched by a mesmerized Kushina. Her long legs were high in the air like a wide V, and her small bent toes pointed at the far walls. Her hands worked hard, plunging the big dildo into her tight flower and pulling it out immediately, her huge chest pressed together and swaying with the action. Want the uncensored 18+ part? $4 per month on Patreon, 380+ hot episodes. Naruto hid in the shadows of the hallway, staring at it with wide-eyed eyes. His big wand immediately began to swell to its full size as he listened to his mother's meows and heavy breathing as she inserted and removed the toy from her. The plastic was wet. He realized this because the light from the TV was falling on it. Soon he couldn't help it, quickly took off his boxers and began to stroke all of his 10 inches, 25 centimeters, MB. His hand quickly began to move up and down along its entire length, spreading over the tightening skin. For a few minutes, Naruto watched his mother play with herself until she came. Obviously, the orgasm was weak, as she just whimpered and shuddered for a few seconds before catching her breath, and later she put her feet on the ground again. Naruto quickly slipped away, his big wand slamming him into his hard abs before his mother recovered and returned to her bedroom. He did not sleep most of the night thinking about his mother's amazing body. He imagined Kushina lying on his bed, and he, stretching her legs with his hands, would plunge his huge wand into her shaved flower. She ran her hands through his tousled blonde hair as he sucked on her plump pink nipples. "Yes, fuck your mommy!" she gasped as his big testicles slapped her round, hard ass loudly over and over again. "Phew!" exclaimed Naruto as his eyes suddenly opened and he squirted white onto the sheets. His body was shaking and his back was arching from the strongest orgasm of his life. And so, after that night, Naruto waited for his mother's disappointment to reach a critical point before he was ready to act on his simple and bold plan. 3 weeks had passed since that night, and he felt that the time had come. Naruto heard his mother open the bedside table and knew what would happen next. He quietly returned to his room before closing the door and turning off the lights. Later, he looked under the door and saw his mother's little feet sneak down the hallway and stop at his door a couple of minutes later. She stood there for a few seconds, listening, before going down to the living room downstairs. Naruto could feel his heart pounding harder as his excitement grew. He waited 5 incredibly long minutes before getting up again, pulling his own wand out of the box under the bed, and returning to open the door. He walked down the stairs as quietly as he could, shadows dancing across his lean, athletic body. As he walked down the stairs, he could make out the soft light of the television, and heard the unmistakable sounds of a movie playing on the screen. He smiled to himself and quickly took off his boxers, his hard wand quickly rising and hitting his stomach. He crept to the corner and looked at the wonderful sight in front of him. Kushina's bathrobe was dropped on the armrest of the couch as she stood naked in the soft light emanating from the TV. She stood on tiptoe, the muscles in her legs bulging out as she leaned forward, one hand resting on the coffee table. Her other hand was sandwiched between her huge chest, which hung tightly under her. Her pink nipples danced in the light of the room as she inserted and removed them from her shaved flower just as she had done that night weeks ago. Her chubby ass squeezed every now and then as she grunted as she watched the two dudes fuck the hot buster redhead. Kushina's thick red hair hung down from one side of her face, and her tongue ran over her pink lips. Exclamation point, whispered Naruto. It was by far the sexiest sight he had ever seen in his life. He made sure to memorize the image in his memory in case his plan failed. His hand instinctively wrapped around his wand, his fingertips not quite touching each other, as he began to slowly stroke it. It's okay, now or never, Naruto thought, swallowing and turning the corner. Mom! Exclaimed Naruto in surprise as he stepped out into the light in the room, his hard wand swaying in the air. Kushina gasped in surprise and stood up, pulling out A with a wet suction sound. She covered her flower with one hand and wrapped the other around her plump chest with the dildo hanging from her arm. However, her chests were so large that one pink nipple protruded above her arm and the other from below. Naruto? What are you doing here? She exclaimed. Her bright purple eyes instantly landed on the huge pillar of flesh protruding from her son's crotch, and she gasped again. Gasped Naruto before chuckling slightly. Well, I kind of came here to do the same thing you did. He waved his right hand at, grinning again, scratching the back of his head. Oh, I see, Kushina said, continuing to look at her son's wand, biting her lower lip. Yes, I'm sorry, I'll go back to my room, Naruto said as he stepped back to the stairs. Every step he took made his wand bounce up and down. No, exclaimed Kushina, looking away from her son's massive wand. I have to go. Naruto stopped and scratched his head again, straining his strong abdominal and arm muscles, a movement that made his wand bounce up and down. Well, you were here first. He paused as if he was thinking before he looked at the TV and saw an image of a porn star girl getting fucked doggy style. What if we both stay? What? Said Kushina, shifting her gaze from her son's crotch to her naked body and to the TV screen. Well, we're both here for the same thing. And we just don't have to hide it from each other. Naruto said as he walked over and sat down on the couch. His hand wrapped around his wand as he looked at his mom. Said Kushina, again shifting her gaze from her son to the film. I think you're right, we shouldn't be hiding from each other. She also sat uncertainly on the sofa, but kept the distance between them. She kept her legs together and her hand on her bare chest as she stared at the screen. Naruto smiled as he watched his mother sit next to him. He spread his knees and began to openly stroke his wand next to her while watching porn. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so excited. So far, his plan has worked perfectly. Oh my god, his wand is huge! Thought Kushina, taking a quick look at her son's wand before returning to the screen again. Her hand, which was between her legs, began to work on her button, and she also relaxed a little. She spread her long legs in front of her and placed her feet on the coffee table. For several minutes, mother and son watched the sex taking place on the screen. Slowly, Naruto crept to the middle of the couch, and Kushina unconsciously did the same. Both of them were breathing heavily openly, and heat emanated from their bodies from excitement. Their thighs touched and rubbed against each other as they watched the hot redhead on the screen take cum on her face and chest. Both mother and son were breathing heavily and sweating when the next scene appeared. The brunette with big chest and ass danced around a muscular stud sitting in a chair. She turned away from him, lowered her plump ass into his lap, and began to rub against his hardness. Fuck, I've always wanted a private dance, Naruto said aloud as he clenched his wand in his fist, placing his other hand on his mother's sweaty thigh. Kushina bit her lower lip, openly looking at her son's crotch. With one hand, she pinched her hard pink nipples and with the other, she inserted 3 fingers into her flower. The discarded was lying on the pillow on the other side of her. Her son's touch on her leg caused a shock in her body, from which she suffocated. Want the uncensored 18+ part? $4 per month on Patreon, 380+ hot episodes. Naruto glanced at his mother as he heard her sigh. He admired her athletic body as she writhed next to him and openly played with her chest. The huge chest swayed as her hand passed from one to the other. Could you show it to me, Mom? He asked, squeezing her thigh gently. She said, biting her lower lip again. I really shouldn't, Naruto dash. Please, he said, watching her chest jiggle and her leg muscles tighten. Her flat stomach went in and out because of her excited breathing. I won't tell Dad. Kushina looked at the screen and saw the man pulling off the girl's bra and wrapping around her big fake chest. I think a little is possible, she said before standing up. Naruto's eyes became like saucers as he watched his mother's huge chest bounce as she stood up. Her legs and hips swayed from side to side as she walked over and stood in front of him. He understood the signal, lowered his hips to the pillow, and spread his legs to make room for her. Kushina's body trembled as she turned away from her son and placed her soft hands on his hips. She looked at him over her shoulder, and she arched her back, starting to sink into her son's lap. She squeezed her round, hard buttocks together, and gasped loudly as she felt his huge wand squeeze between his stomach and her firm ass. Her eyes glazed over as she slowly began to rub her ass against her own son's giant wand. Ah, yes! Exclaimed Naruto, grabbing her slender thighs with his hands and began to snuggle up to her. He could see her huge chest swaying sexily. Kushina's head tilted forward, and she began to breathe heavily. The friction of her hips intensified, and she pushed away from her son's burning touch. Kushina's arms wrapped around her bouncing chest, and the strong muscles in her legs and back that supported her tensed. God, what's wrong with me? She thought to herself. I'm rubbing my ass against my own son's wand. Fuck yes! Exclaimed Naruto, grabbing his mother's chubby, round ass. Soon, her buttocks parted, and the bottom of his huge wand began to rub against her wrinkled hole sandwiched between her cheeks. Kushina chuckled at the forbidden contact. And without even thinking about it, she began to rotate her hips, dropping one hand and wrapping her lemon-sized assicles around her son's testicles. Naruto deftly lowered his hips and pulled his mother's waist as he felt her very wet labia slide down his length before sliding between her buttocks again. He knew that the moment of truth was coming soon, and he didn't want her rationality to get in their way. Naruto, we must. Stop it! Kushina was panting, and her legs continued to work hard. She continued to squeeze his huge balls, feeling her moisture and his pre-cum mix and slide down his length and down her fingers. Naruto ignored his mother as she continued to dance on her lap. Soon he felt what he was waiting for, namely that her labia were approaching the head of his wand. He quickly hugged his mother by the waist and pushed her slightly away from him, lifting her hips. The movement was perfect as the head of his wand slipped in along with the first 4 inches. 10 centimeters. Want the uncensored 18+ part? $4 per month on Patreon. 380+ hot episodes. Aw! He moaned, feeling his mother's flower tighten around him. Kushina's eyes became huge as she felt her son go in and out of her. Her nails dug into his thighs and her knuckles turned white as her flower instinctively clenched around the huge wand. Her back arched, causing her big chest to sway proudly in the soft light of the room. Naruto! She shouted loudly. He gripped her thin waist tightly as he pulled back slightly before pushing almost all of his huge wand into his mother's flower. He watched in amazement as she arched her back, tossing away her long red hair. He licked his lips as he looked down between the halves of her ass and entered the full length. Fuck mom, you're so tight, he said as he got out and slammed back in. Kushina screamed as her own son started fucking her. Her chest bounced wildly and hit each other. Aw! Echoed cries of pleasure filled the house as Kushina's tongue rolled indecently out of her mouth, and her muscles tensed. Her feet were arched so that she was standing on tiptoe, holding her legs together, her arms extended right on either side of her, as she squeezed his strong legs as he pumped his huge wand into her sucking moisture. Naruto smiled again when he heard his mother's passionate cry. Her skin in his hands sweated as he moved them up and around to wrap around her abundant chest. His fingers sank into the thick flesh of her chest as he pressed her against him. Kushina's mouth let out an animalistic roar, and her hands rose and clung to the sofa with a death grip. Finally, after so many months, she got sex. No, she got the sex she needed so badly. Ah! Fuck! Ugh! Fuck your mommy! She screamed, leaning against her son's strong chest. Oh my God, Mom! Said Naruto and bit her shoulder, squeezing her huge chest, making her hard nipples dance in his palms. He began to sweat with tension and excitement as he was finally living out his biggest fantasy. For several minutes, mother and son beat against each other. Obscenities and encouragement emanated from both as long as they succumbed to the taboo pleasure they experienced. Naruto looked down and saw his mom's ass jiggle as his legs hit her hard. He threw his head back and moaned in pleasure as he felt the wet, tight walls of his flower slide up and down his length. He suddenly let go of her bouncing chest and let his hands slide back to her slender waist. He pressed her to his lap. My legs need a break, he gasped as Kushina pressed her ass against him. Kushina blew a strand of her red hair off her face, as she too was breathing heavily from the exertion. She looked at her luscious body, covered in sweat and glowing with the light of the TV. Her hands were still tightly gripping her son's hips. She looked at the screen and saw the brunette on her face, and at this time another man entered the room. You cheated on me, whore! shouted the man, who was clearly a boyfriend or husband. Kushina's eyes widened as she returned to reality. Guilt for her actions began to creep into her thoughts as she became aware of her surroundings again. Oh God! We must stop! Gritting her teeth, Kushina slowly began to rise from her son's steel rod. Finally, she was released with a wet suction sound and an audible pop. Her legs were shaking and she had to lean against the coffee table to keep herself from falling, which essentially caused her son to see her stretched whole. Wait, Mom! Exclaimed Naruto. He had finally achieved what he had been waiting for, and he had no intention of missing it. He grabbed her hips again and turned around, laying her on the sofa. He watched as her incredibly huge chest hit each other and swayed. He quickly threw his leg over her. Naruto, we have to stop! Her hands grabbed his legs again, but she couldn't find any lever to push him away. You can't leave me in this state, he said, squeezing his wet hard wand with his hands and pressing his swollen head against her chest. He smiled at her, leaving a mark on her skin. Wrap him in those big chests. Kushina bit her lower lip again as she looked down the stairs leading to her sleeping husband before returning her gaze back to the teenager's hard wand in front of her. Okay, she said hesitantly. She decided that chests were better than letting him back in. If I can make him come with my chest, then it'll be over. And I'll tell him later that this will never happen again, she thought to herself as she squeezed her soft hemispheres together. Naruto gasped at the sight of his mom's huge chest flattened around his manhood. Her 5-yen-sized halo was plump and dark pink, and her hard nipples stuck out like pencil erasers. Her chests were so big that he could only see the tip of his wand sandwiched between them. Your chest looks so hot, Mom, said Naruto, placing one hand on the back of the couch to support himself while the other reached out to pinch her right nipple. He threw his hips back and slid forward as he started fucking his mother's chest. Kushina watched with a mesmerized look as the head of her son's plum-sized wand popped out from under her pale, sweaty chest as they shook in her hands from the thrusts of his thighs. Later, her gaze slid up and she began to admire her son's sweaty, athletic, thin body. His six-pack abs contracted as he worked his legs, and his pectoral muscles and biceps also contracted slightly from the movements. He has to shave his balls, she thought, feeling his hairy and testicles slide over her skin, thereby tingling her. Fuck, that's so fucking awesome, exclaimed Naruto, pulling his wand out of Kushina's chest. He slapped them on the tops as she continued to hold them together. They both watched as the flesh shook from the wet flip-flops. He ran the sensitive lower part of his wand over her nipples, forcing her to suck air through her teeth. Kushina whimpered, feeling helpless to do anything about the massive wand rubbing against her chest. She bit her lower lip again, admiring the sight. He's so big, she thought, watching her son rub her chest. However, Naruto quickly became impatient and sank back into his mother's warm, hot chest. Ugh! Fucking, yes? He said as he began to push rapidly. I love fucking your big chest, Mom, said Naruto with a big smile as a trickle of sweat flooded his cheek. He grabbed the back of the couch again with one hand for support, but with the other he reached back and grabbed his mother's shaved wet flower, continuing to thrust. Kushina screamed as her son thrust 3 fingers into her wet hole. Her back involuntarily arched, causing her son's wand to free itself from her cleavage. However, Naruto quickly grabbed his hard pole and stabbed it back into her soft chest. Kushina's knees closed tightly, her hips spinning as she pushed off her son's invading fingers. Naruto breathed heavily as he continued to fuck her cleavage. He could hear wet sounds coming from her flower as he moved his fingers in and out. Kushina was breathing heavily, swaying her sexy hips on her son's arm. Her neck was curved, and her eyes were closed with intense pleasure. I want, she exhaled. I want it so much. Naruto smiled at his curvy mother as he pulled his huge wand out of her trembling chest. Then he released his fingers and stood next to the sofa. I want to make you, Mom, he said, slowly stroking his wand. Get up and I'll give you the strongest orgasm of your life. Kushina was still breathing heavily and stood up, looking out the window behind the sofa. Her chest pressed against the glass as she looked out over the dark street in front of her house. Her breath froze on the chilled glass, and she enjoyed the coldness of her sensitive nipples. She looked over her shoulder as she felt one of her son's hands resting on her rounded buttocks. She watched as he approached her from behind and began to guide his huge tool back to her gaping flower. Okay, I'll just let him put that back into me and then I'll tell him to stop, she thought, feeling the swollen head thrust into her stretched lips. Her eyes fluttered, and later she gasped at the contact. Naruto shook as he prepared to straddle his mother's beautiful ass. Squeezing his wand tightly, he stuck his head inside. He moaned, wrapping both hands around the round balls of her ass and began to thrust against her slippery pink walls. Fuck, you have the tightest flower, Mom, he said, watching her labia expand around his massive wand as he moved inch by inch. Soon, it hit rock bottom, and neither of them moved as they were both used to this feeling. Naruto's eyes slowly moved upwards from the sight of his pelvis pressing against his mother's round ass, to her bright purple eyes, and to her wide, gasping mouth. He thought she looked sexier than any porn star he'd ever seen. He smiled at her, bending his strong legs and halfway out of her before pushing back. Kushina screamed as she put one hand behind her back and placed her hand on her son's hard belly. Fuck mommy! She encouraged her son, resisting his pushes. The living room quickly filled with the sound of their bodies hitting each other. Porn on TV was forgotten, and the credits rolled as mother and son brutally fucked each other. Kushina's eyes were tightly closed, and her teeth clenched as she squeezed the huge wand that slammed into her womb. Naruto squeezed his mother's firm buttocks as he snorted and slammed all the way to Kushina's depths. He loved the look of his mother's huge chest as they pressed against the glass of the window and stuck out from the sides. Fuck, that wand is just huge! Exclaimed Kushina as her head sank so that her long red hair fell over her face. Her hands went up and slapped the window as she began to moan with a low sound coming from her throat. She began to feel a tingling sensation at the base of her abdomen as she felt her orgasm build. Naruto placed one foot on the couch while placing the other foot on the wooden floor. He looked down and saw the thick veins of this wand, now shiny and wet with the combined juices, tightly squeezed as he thrust and pulled out. He squeezed her ass hard, leaving pink handprints on her cheeks before pushing them up and wrapping around her slender waist. Fuck. I'm going to, he exclaimed, feeling his stomach quiver and his balls clench. Kushina's eyes widened, and she looked back over her shoulder at her handsome son. Not inside. You can come on my big chest if you want. Naruto ignored her and continued stabbing. He didn't know if he would ever get such a chance again, and he wanted to enjoy it to the fullest. He wanted to fill her with his sperm. Want the uncensored 18+ part? $4 per month on Patreon, 380+ hot episodes. Oh! Exclaimed Kushina, as if she had been struck by lightning. I'm coming! She shouted and suddenly stopped squeezing at her son. Her small fists clenched the top of the couch like a vice, and her whole body began to tremble from the most intense orgasm of her life. Naruto's eyes widened as he saw his gorgeous mother coming. Her muscles were flexing. Get my flower, Mom! Shouted Naruto. 6 strong macaws later, he fully entered her and stained her uterus with thick white streams of semen. His back and ass tightened as he shot his seed into his own mother over and over again. Kushina screamed as her son's wand covered her insides, and she exploded in an even more intense orgasm than before. Bright white sparks appeared in her eyes, and she suddenly stopped breathing. Her toes curled and her legs bent over and over again as she felt her son's thick wand fill her. Mother, said Naruto, it seemed like he was coming forever. It was the most powerful orgasm in his life. He pushed his mother even further, so that she was now completely pressed against the sofa and the window. Her heavy breathing clouded the glass. Naruto exhaled as he felt his wand bend over as he released another jet. Pulling out his wand, he looked down and watched in amazement as his thick wand leaked out of his mother and fell onto the couch. For 5 minutes, mother and son were breathing heavily after orgasm. Naruto's wand sagged slightly, but still looked quite thick and intimidating. Naruto sat down on the coffee table, breathing heavily and sweating. He admired his mother's body as she knelt, turning away from him, her cheek pressed against her chest. "Fuck Mom, that was amazing. What did I do?" thought Kushina, continuing to shake with post-orgasmic bliss. Strands of her hair fell on her sweaty forehead as her gaze found a family photo of her and Minato smiling while their son stood between them. "Oh my God, what have I done?"